Drive north out of London, and the city doesn't so much end as it gradually forgets itself. The streets lose their density, the buildings lose their ambition, and somewhere along the A10, the old Great Cambridge Road, you pass through a stretch of North London that looks, by any fair measure, entirely unremarkable. A retail park on the left, light industrial units behind a low fence, a gym, a storage facility, the kind of landscape you pass through without registering because there is nothing to register, nothing announcing itself, nothing asking to be seen. But there is something here, or rather, there was something here. Something significant enough that when I started researching this particular stretch of Enfield, I kept arriving at the same realization that one of the most important chapters in British industrial history played out on a road that gives you absolutely no indication that anything ever happened on it. I'm Jonathan Reed. I look at the physical spaces where history happened: factories, industrial buildings, infrastructure, the places that shaped how ordinary people actually lived. And this road, unremarkable as it now appears, sits at the center of a story I think deserves to be told properly. This is the story of Ferguson Electronics, the story of how Britain built a television empire on a flat road in a North London suburb, and what happened when that empire fell. If you're new here, and this kind of history interests you, the industrial, the architectural, the quietly significant, consider subscribing. I make these for people who want to understand the places behind the things. Let's start with what was actually here, because that requires some reconstruction. The Ferguson factory complex on Southbury Road, its address on the Great Cambridge Road, was not a monument. It was not designed to impress. It was designed to produce long, flat-roofed industrial structures, functional, mid-century British manufacturing architecture at its most honest. The kind of building that says, we are here to work, not to be admired. At its height, the site was one of the largest consumer electronics manufacturing operations in the United Kingdom. Thousands of workers arriving each morning in shifts, bikes against the fence, cars filling the car park from early, buses pulling in from the surrounding streets of Enfield and Edmonton and Ponders End and Southbury. A shift change looked like a small, self-contained migration, hundreds of people moving through the same gate in the same direction, calling to each other, queuing at the T-van. Inside, the smell would have hit you first. Anyone who has spent time in an electronics assembly environment from that era will know what I mean. Solder, a warm, acrid, metallic smell, the smell of permanent connections being made. Beneath that, heated plastic and the particular sharp edge of high-voltage components being brought to life for the first time. And underneath all of it, the absorbed scent of a building that had been doing the same thing for years. Not unpleasant exactly, just specific, industrial, real. The sound was layered. A moving belt, the central mechanical fact of any assembly line, sets a pace that everything else organizes around. Above it, the click of components being seated, the hiss of soldering irons, voices across the line, a radio at the far end of the floor playing something that nobody was entirely listening to. Not the deafening roar of heavy industry, something steadier, a working hum, the kind of sound that workers later told interviewers they stopped hearing after the first week because it became the condition within which all other sound existed. Rows of women at the assembly stations. The archive photographs from 1964 make this plain. Head down, hands moving with the particular speed of people who have done the same precise task 10,000 times and could do it 10,000 more, winding coils, fitting components to circuit boards, guiding chassis along the belt to the next station, where the next pair of hands would take over their specific portion of the process, each station dependent on the one before it, each person a link. The democratic constraint of the moving line meant that no single station could be rushed beyond what the work itself required. At the end of the line were the test bays. Every single set before it left the factory had to produce a picture. A technician would connect an antenna, apply a signal, and watch the screen come to life. In the early years of color production, that first image on a set you had assembled yourself must have been something to witness, the proof that what you had built worked, that the connection was good, that the hands had done the job. This is the physical reality I want you to hold in your mind for the rest of what I'm going to tell you, because the numbers and the corporate decisions and the market forces that come later are easier to understand when you can see the place where they landed. To understand Ferguson, you cannot begin with the factory. You have to begin somewhere else entirely, with a young man in Vienna at the end of the First World War, standing in the ruins of an empire that had dissolved around him. His name was Jules Thorne, born Joel Thorne in Vienna on the 7th of February, 1919. The son of a Jewish family in a city that, at the moment of his birth, was the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, one of the great powers of the world. He grew up in that city, was educated there. When the war came, he was conscripted into the Austrian army and fought for a cause that ended in defeat. The empire that had been the context of his entire childhood simply ceased to exist. Vienna was left as the capital of a small, exhausted, reduced country. A young man with a business education and no particular prospects surveyed what remained and decided to look elsewhere. He arrived in Britain in 1923, not as a refugee, not fleeing anything yet, simply as a traveling salesman. His employer was an Austrian manufacturer of gas mantles, and his territory was England. For 3 years, he traveled the country, calling on shops and wholesalers, persuading strangers in a language that wasn't quite his to buy things they didn't necessarily know they needed. It was, in retrospect, a particular kind of education, the education of the road, of learning a country through its people and its commerce rather than through its books. In 1926, his employer went bankrupt. Jules Thorne was in his late 20s, in a country that wasn't legally his, with no employer and no obvious next step. He could have gone home. He chose not to. In 1928, with his business partner Alfred Deutsch, another Austrian, another pragmatic engineer, Thorne incorporated the Electric Lamp Service Company. The capital was modest, the premises were modest, the ambition was not. They began by importing light bulbs, electric lamps from the European continent sold into a British market that was actively electrifying itself, street by street, year by year, creating a demand for light that nobody was satisfying cheaply enough. Thorne identified the gap and walked through it with methodical determination. And then, characteristically, he didn't just sell, he manufactured. In 1932, he acquired the Atlas Lamp Works in Edmonton, North London, just down the road where the Ferguson factory would eventually stand. By the end of 1933, he was producing his own bulbs, Atlas lamps, British-made, from a North London factory run by a man from Vienna who was still, in the eyes of the law, and perhaps in some private part of himself, an outsider. What followed over the next 2 decades was the systematic dismantling of the light bulb cartel that controlled the British market, a cartel that fixed prices to suit itself and had every institutional reason to protect its position. Thorne challenged it for years, patient, methodical, not easily deterred. By 1956, he had broken it. That is the kind of man he was. By 1935, he had acquired Ferguson Radio Corporation, a company with an existing factory in Enfield making radio sets. Now he could not just sell, not just manufacture components, he could produce finished consumer goods. And in 1936, he merged his various interests into Thorn Electrical Industries and floated the company on the London Stock Exchange. I want to pause on that for a moment. This man had arrived in Britain 13 years earlier with almost nothing, without citizenship, without language, without any particular reason to believe this country would give him a footing. And yet, by 1936, he was the chairman of a publicly listed British company. There is something in that worth sitting with, not as a simple success story, because nothing about it was simple, but as evidence of what a particular kind of determined, patient, unsentimental intelligence can build when it identifies where the gaps are. The television that would later sit in the corner of the British living room, the set that showed the coronation, the moon landing, the Cuck final, the Queen's speech, was the creation at its origin of a Viennese Jewish immigrant who had once sold light bulbs from a bicycle basket. Britain would come to regard Ferguson as entirely its own, and in a real, meaningful sense it was, made here by workers who were born here on a road in North London. But the foundational intelligence, the drive, the particular refusal to accept that a market had to work the way it currently worked, that came from elsewhere, from a young man who looked at a country that wasn't his and decided it was worth building something in. He was knighted in 1964, Sir Jules Thorne. He died in December 1980, aged 81, not long after seeing his company complete a takeover of its great rival EMI. He never saw what came after. Perhaps, as I've come to think, that was something close to a mercy. The Enfield factory started with radios. That was what Ferguson made in its early years, wireless sets for a Britain that was rapidly falling in love with broadcast sound. By the late 1930s, the wireless was as common in British homes as a kettle, and the Enfield factory was one of the workshops of that transformation. Then the war came, and the factory changed. You cannot maintain a consumer electronics production line when the country is mobilizing everything it has for survival. The Enfield works converted to military production, searchlights, radio components, the hardware of a conflict that consumed everything the country could manufacture. For 6 years, the factory made things that were used in darkness by frightened people hoping to survive until morning. It is worth naming that plainly, because factories are not neutral spaces. They absorb the history of what they've produced, even when that history is invisible. When peace came, the return to civilian production was slow. The transition took time. Machinery had to be reconfigured, supply chains rebuilt, a workforce resettled into peacetime rhythms. But by 1946, the first Ferguson television set had been produced. The factory was now oriented towards a future that nobody could see clearly yet, but that everyone sensed approaching. Television, not the radio, something new, a box with a picture in it, a window beyond the four walls of your room. At first, it felt like a luxury. The sets were expensive, the screens were small, the picture could be unreliable. Most people who had seen television had seen it somewhere else, in a neighbor's house, through a shop window, in a pub that had acquired one as a novelty. Ownership felt for most British families like something that might eventually be possible.
And then came June the 2nd, 1953. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II was broadcast live. More than 20 million people watched it, in homes, in neighbors' homes, in church halls and working men's clubs, and anywhere a screen could be found. It was the moment television ceased to be a curiosity and became a national medium, the thing the country did together in separate rooms at the same time. Jules Thorne understood immediately what had happened. Within months, the decision was made to expand the Enfield operation. A new, larger factory on Southbury Road, on the Great Cambridge Road itself, built for the scale of production that the new demand required. The existing facility on Lincoln Road had been adequate for radios and the first tentative television sets. What was coming required something built to last. The production lines extended, more workers were taken on, and Thorn Electrical Industries moved to consolidate its position not simply as a manufacturer, but as the manufacturer. What happened next was the rental model, and it is one of the genuinely ingenious commercial constructions of post-war Britain. Most British families in the 1950s could not afford to buy a television outright, and the early sets were unreliable enough that ownership felt like a financial risk. The solution Thorne offered was this: a small weekly payment and a set arrived on the back of a van, connected by a technician who left a number to call when it went wrong. If it broke, you called, and the van returned. No large upfront cost, no financial gamble on a machine that might fail you in the first month. Thorne's domestic electrical rental operation, DER, had been offering versions of this service since the 1930s. Now it became the engine of a television revolution. And the structural genius of it was this: the company renting you the television was the same company that had made it. Thorne built the set in Enfield. Thorne's van brought it to your door. Thorne's technician fixed it when the picture deteriorated. The money moved in a closed circle, a loop entirely within a single corporate structure. The empire grew with each turn of that loop. By 1961, Thorne had formally become the largest producer of radio and television sets in Britain. The Ferguson name was joined in the portfolio by Ultra, by HMV, by Marconiphone. All of them manufactured in Thorne factories, all of them delivered through Thorne rental networks, all of them serviced by Thorne technicians. And then came color. BBC Two began broadcasting in color in July 1967. Full color on BBC One and ITV followed in November 1969. The race to produce color television sets was underway, and it was a race that required access to color tube technology that was extremely difficult to acquire in Britain. Thorne's competitors were scrambling for solutions. Jules Thorne's response, characteristically, was to engineer around the obstacle. Blank tubes imported from the United States. Color-sensitive chemicals applied in Thorne's own facilities. An improvised process, but it worked. And it worked well enough to allow Thorne to offer something no other manufacturer in the world had yet achieved: the world's first all-transistor color television. Every other company's color set at that moment was a hybrid, valves and transistors combined. Thorne's was entirely solid state. It was, by the standards of 1967, a remarkable engineering achievement. They sold every set at a loss. Jules Thorne acknowledged this directly. The decision was deliberate: establish dominance in the color market regardless of short-term cost, because the long-term position was worth more than the immediate profit. And so, on the production line at the Great Cambridge Road factory in Enfield in the autumn of 1967, the Ferguson 3700 Color Star took shape. The world's first commercially available solid-state color television. Made in a suburb of North London, by workers who went home that evening and did not necessarily know what they had built. By 1968, Thorne had acquired radio rentals for £155 million, an enormous sum, making the combined group the largest television rental operation in Britain, with around 1,300 shops and 2.5 million subscribers. 1 in 3 televisions rented in Britain now came through a Thorne company. Over 50 major factories in the United Kingdom, 100,000 employees worldwide, Ferguson, Ultra, HMV, Marconiphone, Tri-City Cookers, DER, Radio Rentals, Mazda Lamps, an electrical empire of a kind that Britain has not seen since and is unlikely to see again. At its heart, a factory on a flat road in North London, where workers arrived each morning and built the device that Britain watched the world through. I want to stay with Enfield for a moment, because what I find genuinely interesting about this history is not just the corporate scale of what Thorne built, it's the physical and social texture of what the factory created in the immediate geography around it. A factory of this size does not simply employ people, it shapes a community, it generates a local economy, it produces a particular kind of collective identity, a sense shared by the people who live within its orbit that they are part of something that matters. The workers came largely from the surrounding streets: Enfield, Edmonton, Southbury, Ponders End. North London families, many of whom had moved outward from the inner boroughs in the post-war years, following the new housing estates and terrace streets of outer London, arriving at a place where there was steady employment and a reason to stay. Fathers who had done something else entirely found their children joining the Ferguson line. Mothers brought daughters. The area had a deep tradition of precision manufacturing running through it like a structural seam. The Royal Small Arms Factory was nearby, the factory that had given its name to the Lee Enfield rifle. Hotpoint was producing dishwashers in another part of the borough. The entire Lee Valley corridor hummed with the sound of things being made with care and precision. Enfield called itself, with some justification, the British Silicon Valley. That description was not bravado, it was geographic fact, a concentration of electronics and precision manufacturing in a small area of North London that had no real equivalent elsewhere in the country. The pubs on those streets filled on Friday evenings. The factory canteens served tea and something hot at the breaks. The working men's clubs of Edmonton and Enfield held people who had spent the week on the line, who had opinions about the weekend's football and the state of wages and what management were likely to announce next month, who would be back on Monday morning without giving it a second thought, because this is what you did. It was what the street did. It paid the mortgage and kept the lights on, and there was nothing inadequate about any of that. And there was a particular intimacy between the factory and the living room that I think is worth naming specifically. The same company that made the television rented it to you, fixed it when it went wrong, replaced it when the color era arrived and your black and white set was no longer adequate. The radio rentals van that appeared on your street was driven by someone trained by the same company that had built what was in the back. When the set failed, it returned to people who understood it from the inside because they had built its predecessor. There was a coherence to it, a completeness. The money, the labor, the expertise, the product, all of it moving within a bounded geography, touching the same community at multiple points. That kind of integration feels very remote now, in an era of extended warranties from companies in other countries subcontracted to other companies, where the person who made the thing and the person who fixes the thing have never been within 500 miles of each other.
At its peak, Thorn EMI controlled approximately half of all color television sales in Britain. The Ferguson brand was not simply dominant. For millions of people, it had become simply the word for television, the way Hoover became the word for vacuum cleaner, or bureau for ballpoint pen. The category and the brand had collapsed into each other in domestic vocabulary. Ferguson, the television, the one in the corner. In Enfield, they made it. By 1983, every other British color television manufacturer had already gone. Decca, gone. GEC, gone. ITT, gone. Even within the Thorne Group itself, the Rank Television Factory in Bradford, once described as the most modern and largest television factory in Europe, had closed in 1978 with the loss of 2,200 jobs. 2,200 people in a single announcement in a single city, gone from the industry. Ferguson had survived all of it. The last British color television manufacturer, still on the Great Cambridge Road, still shipping sets, still feeding the rental empire that kept the larger structure turning. The TX range was performing well in 1982. The TX 100 chassis, launched in 1983, was a genuine piece of engineering. 23% fewer adjustments required during production. 5% fewer components than its predecessor. The engineers at Enfield were not standing still. They were building something that was, by any fair assessment, a competitive and capable product. Thorn EMI, the combined group following the 1979 merger with EMI, was one of the largest companies in Britain. More than 80,000 employees worldwide. Sales exceeding £3 billion. A conglomerate that spanned television manufacturing, recorded music, the Beatles catalog sat inside this portfolio, Defense electronics, retail, lighting. Ferguson was not a failing company in 1983. It was the consumer electronics division of an enormous conglomerate, and it was the last division of its kind still standing when all the others had collapsed. And yet, standing at that moment, if you knew where to look, something didn't quite add up. The merger with EMI in 1979 had created an unwieldy and genuinely complex sprawl of businesses that had very little natural connection to each other. Management consultants from Boston had been brought in to apply a planning framework across the portfolio, a framework designed for managing diversified corporate structures. What that framework did, in documented practice, was direct capital away from profitable existing operations toward developing new areas of the business. The money generated by Ferguson's manufacturing and the rental network was being redirected elsewhere, rather than reinvested in the factory floor that had generated it. Jules Thorne had died in December 1980, the man who understood manufacturing from the inside, who had built a factory from nothing, who knew from direct experience what a production line required to remain competitive, whose instinct, formed over 50 years of building things, was always to make the product better before making the structure grander. He was gone. What remained was a conglomerate being managed by people whose considerable skills were in finance, in deal-making, in the management of large and complex corporate portfolios, not in the specific, demanding, unglamorous discipline of keeping a factory competitive in a market that was changing faster than anyone had fully admitted. The Japanese manufacturers did not arrive suddenly. I want to be careful and accurate about this, because the easy version of this story, the invasion narrative, is not the honest one. What happened to Ferguson happened the way most serious structural damage happens. Slowly, then quickly, gradually enough for years that it was possible to look elsewhere, then all at once.
By the mid-1970s, manufacturers in Japan had been systematically transforming how consumer electronics were produced. JVC, Sony, Hitachi, Sanyo, Panasonic, the names were already familiar in British shops. What was less visible from the outside was the operational philosophy behind those names. Japanese factories in this period were running on a discipline of continuous improvement. The idea, formalized as Kaizen, that no process is ever finished, that every manufacturing system can always be made fractionally better than it was yesterday and fractionally better again tomorrow, not in dramatic leaps, but in the relentless accumulation of small refinements, reduced defect rates, faster cycle times, lower unit costs, year after year. The British manufacturing tradition did not have an equivalent philosophy, not because British workers were less capable, the engineering at Enfield was genuinely good, but because the systems, the factory organization, the philosophy of production that surrounded the engineering had not evolved in the same direction. It was a structural difference, not a human one. What this meant in practice was that Japanese television sets through the late 1970s and into the 80s were improving in reliability while simultaneously falling in price at a rate that British manufacturers were not matching. The gap was real, and it was growing, quietly, year by year, in the background of decisions being made in Thorn EMI boardrooms about portfolio strategy. And there was something specific to Ferguson's situation that made this harder to see in time. The rental model, Thorne's great construction, the system that had put televisions in millions of homes that could never have afforded to buy outright, had also, by the late 1970s, built a wall around the company's ability to hear the competitive signal. A manufacturer who must win customers in an open retail market learns what customers want, because dissatisfied customers simply walk away and buy something else. That feedback is immediate and unambiguous. A manufacturer who supplies a captive rental fleet does not receive that feedback because the rental customer does not walk away.
The Thorne Group decided what went on the van. The customer received what arrived. This insulation was not permanent. The rental market itself was beginning to contract as Japanese-made sets became cheap enough for ordinary families to purchase outright rather than rent. But the insulation lasted long enough to delay the moment of reckoning. And when that moment arrived, it arrived as a crisis rather than as a manageable transition, because the decade before it had not been spent preparing. It is tempting in a history like this to look for the villains. It would be satisfying to find them, the executives who chose their own interests over the workforce, the ideologically driven politicians who removed the supports that might have protected British manufacturing, the financial engineers who extracted value without creating any. Tempting, and not entirely without foundation. But it is not in the end the most honest account. The decisions that ended Ferguson were not, for the most part, made by people intending to end Ferguson. They were made by people trying to solve the problem in front of them while being structurally unable to see the problems their solutions were creating around the corner. Consider them in sequence.
The first, treating Ferguson as a portfolio asset rather than a factory. After the Thorn EMI merger, Ferguson became a line on a spreadsheet inside a conglomerate of hundreds of lines on dozens of spreadsheets. The Boston Consulting Group framework assessed each division by its market position and growth prospects. Ferguson, established within its protected rental market, generating consistent revenue, not obviously in acute difficulty, was classified as a cash generator. In the language of the portfolio model, that meant capital should flow out of it toward areas requiring development rather than back into the manufacturing capability that had generated the profit. The internal logic was consistent. The problem was that it was entirely disconnected from what Japanese manufacturers were doing with their capital in those same years, investing heavily in automation, in quality systems, in the kind of structural improvement that reduces costs while raising output. The gap, already present, was allowed to widen invisibly. The second, maintaining the rental structure rather than preparing for open market competition. The rental model had been the foundation of Thorne's dominance. It was also, by the late 1970s, the reason the company couldn't hear the alarm. When the rental market itself began to contract, when the Japanese sets that Ferguson couldn't match on price became cheap enough for people to simply buy, the floor moved under the entire structure at once. The response, when it finally came, was reactive rather than prepared, because the preparation hadn't happened. The third, the 1979 merger and what it cost. £165 million for EMI. Years of managing a conglomerate so diverse, music, television, film, defense, food mixers, lighting, rental shops, that no single executive perspective could hold it coherently. One contemporary analysis described Thorn EMI in this period as less like a successful operating company and more like a weak investment portfolio. That is a harsh judgment and perhaps slightly unfair to the genuine complexity of what management faced, but it captures something real. The conglomerate form was not suited to the kind of focused, capital-intensive competition that Ferguson needed to survive the 1980s. And then the fourth, the sale to Thomson in 1987. By 1987, the diagnosis was clear. Consumer electronics, Ferguson, was structurally unprofitable to manufacture in Britain at the price the open market demanded. Thomson, the French state-owned electronics company, offered to acquire it. The argument made at the time, and perhaps genuinely believed, was that a larger European group could provide Ferguson with the scale and resources that Thorn EMI had failed to deliver, that the brand could survive under French ownership. The brand was what Thomson wanted. The Ferguson name carried extraordinary recognition in British living rooms. That recognition was the key to the British market. The factory, the workers, the line, the test bays, the institutional knowledge accumulated over 4 decades was not what Thomson needed. The workers on the Great Cambridge Road heard about it through the news.
The way you hear about decisions made about you in rooms you were never invited into. The line doesn't stop all at once. That's not how it happens. What happens is that the changes begin arriving, small ones first, announced in carefully worded internal communications, restructuring, rationalization, the consolidation of certain functions. The language is chosen for its neutrality, and it does cushion the landing for a while. But if you know what you are listening for, the meaning is clear enough. In 2017, a small British company called Cello Electronics began manufacturing Ferguson televisions in Bishop Auckland, County Durham. A genuine attempt to bring the name back to British production, to British workers, to British hands. There is something genuinely moving in that, the name finding its way, after all those corporate transactions and all those decades, back to a factory floor in this country. But it is not Enfield. It is not the Great Cambridge Road. It is something new wearing an old name, which is perhaps the best that can be done with what remains, and not quite the same thing. The factory is gone, the road runs on, and somewhere in the distance between what was built here and what remains of it, there is a question that I find myself returning to every time I look at this kind of history. Not simply what happened to Ferguson, or even what might have been done differently, but something broader and harder to answer cleanly. When a community stops being the place where something is made and becomes simply the place where things made elsewhere are consumed, what does it lose that isn't immediately visible? What capacity, what knowledge, what sense of its own usefulness disappears slowly enough that nobody quite marks the moment it went? The silence on the Great Cambridge Road is, in its way, an answer to that question. I just haven't fully worked out whether it's the only one.